Hello, everybody. Thank you for the organisers for inviting me to talk. I'm delighted to be here today to be able to present to you my project looking at hearing restoration. And so why am I interested in hearing restoration? Well, it's simply because hearing loss is such a major problem worldwide, affecting nearly 500 million people, and that's a number that's projected to grow in the years to come. The good news for patients suffering from hearing loss is that there's already a solution out there in the shape of cochlear implants that work by transforming the sound into an electrical stimulation of the auditory nerve. However, despite the massive success of cochlear implants giving hearing restoration to over 1 million patients worldwide, they do suffer from serious limitations. So when you're at the poster session, it's great, but it's super noisy. There's a lot of information going on. With cochlear implants, it's really difficult to be in such an environment, and patients report preferring just to turn their devices off when in such a noisy environment. Another key limitation of cochlear implants is the ability to appreciate more complex sounds, such as music. Therefore, there's a need for improved hearing restoration. And so our idea was, well, instead of stimulating the cochlea, which is at the base of the auditory system, why not stimulate directly the auditory cortex? It's a much larger area, and it doesn't only encode for frequency and intensity like the cochlea, but also other aspects of sound, such as noise and attention. So the questions we have are cortical implants a viable form of hearing restoration? And how do they compare to the current state-of-the-art cochlear implants? To answer these questions, first thing we had to do was create implant models. This wasn't easy because we were working in mice, and mice are very small, but we successfully managed to insert 4 electrodes into the mouse's cochlea for the cochlear implants, and for the cortical implants, we placed 32 electrodes above the auditory cortex. And then we used these implants to test different aspects of sounds through a series of go, no-go tasks. Due to time limitations, I'll just present task 1, but if you're interested in the other tasks, please come and find me after the talk. So task 1 is single electrode categorization, which is the equivalent of pure tone categorization. And the first thing we find is that it takes the mice significantly longer to reach their best performance with the cortical implants compared to the cochlear implants. However, it was worth the wait, as the mice performed significantly better with the cortical implants compared to the cochlear implants. In fact, in this task, it was on a similar level to sounds. So some intermediate conclusions here. First of all, chronic cochlear and cortical implants are possible in mice. That's non-trivial. And the mice can use these implants to perform behavioral tasks. And what we saw throughout pretty much all the tasks is that whilst it takes the mice longer to reach their best performance with the cortical implants, their performance is significantly better. However, there's still one big question really remaining. What are the mice actually perceiving when we're stimulating the auditory cortex? And so to answer this question, we trained the mice until they reached their maximum performance with the cortical implants, and then we tested them the very next day with sounds. If they're perceiving sounds, they'll be able to perform the task immediately. If they're perceiving something else, it will take them several days to learn. What was great is they were able to perform the task the very next day. It's not perfect. There's some limitations, perhaps in the electrode placement and electrical spread, but they can perform the task. And we also did this the other way around, so we trained mice on sounds, and then we tested them on cortical implants, and once again, they could switch between the different modalities. This means that the perception perceived from the cortical implants is similar to sounds, and that cortical implants are a viable form of hearing restoration, and very excitingly, they seem to have more potential than cochlear implants. We're still very far away from humans now, we're in mice, but that does give us one advantage, is we can try to answer the question of what is actually happening in auditory cortex upon cochlear and cortical stimulation. And so to answer this question, we did in vivo electrophysiology in primary auditory cortex and presented sound, cortical, and with the help of Natasha, a PhD student in the lab, cochlear stimulation. The first thing to note is we find these nice responses to the different stimuli. And when we looked within the auditory cortex, what was happening to a single frequency, for sounds, we find this nice column of activity basically representing the tonotopic axis. And we also see this strong activity in the deeper layers. With cortical stimulation, we find very similar columns of activity, but we also see this strong activity on the surface where we're stimulating. With cochlear implants, though, it's a slightly different story. We see this column of activity, but it's slightly wider, slightly more diffuse, more imprecise. We then wanted to see how similar these neuronal responses were to the different stimuli. And so for this, we trained an SVM to decode between spontaneous or sound-evoked activity. And then we took that SVM and tested it not only on sounds, but also on cortical and cochlear-evoked activity. And what we found was the SVM performed really well with sound and with cortical stimulation, but significantly worse with cochlear stimulation, meaning that the neuronal responses to the cochlear stimulation are different or more different to sound than the cortical stimulation. And to confirm this further, we trained another classifier to classify between sound, cortical, and cochlear responses. And here what we found was that the cochlear responses were quite distinct because the classifier was accurate 75% of the time, whereas with cortical and sound stimulation, it wasn't as accurate, 55% accurate, and a third of the time it's getting confused amongst themselves. Meaning that, first of all, we found that cochlear and cortical stimulations do give neuronal responses that are similar to sounds, but they're more similar for the cortical stimulation than the cochlear stimulation. So just as a brief summary, mice perform better with cortical implants than with cochlear implants, and the perception that comes from these cortical implants are similar to sounds. And that's also reflected in the neuronal activity. So this is really just the first step of a long process, but hopefully in the years to come, we'll be able to get cortical implants into patients and improve the lives of millions. So I just want to finish by thanking everybody involved in this project. And this is just a small part of a much larger project, Project Sealight, which was spearheaded by Brice Batelier. And I also want to thank Tanya Barkat and the whole lab, and thank you for your attention.
We have time for a couple questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the nice talk. I was wondering, so for humans, we rather want to understand language first of all, right? And cochlear implant users have to relearn their hearing, basically. And so before going to cortex, there's also other structures of the brain that kind of contribute to this process. And if you were to implant in cortex, then you would skip all of this, right? How do you think of this challenge when translating to humans? Thank you.
The challenge is also there in mice, right? So it's something that I'm really interested in. I haven't done the experiment yet, but I want to record in inferior colliculus and in auditory thalamus to try and understand what is happening. Why are the mice capable of perceiving sounds when we're skipping all of the auditory pathway? A big part of that might just be the feedback circuits from the auditory cortex to these other areas, but it's something that I'm really interested in.
Okay, thank you.
I'll speak loud. Oh, okay. Super cool work. So that should be said loudly, for course. So I understand that the mice have two input channels right now from your artificial stimulation, but still they have hearing, right? So can you speculate in the future it may be actually easier if basically you're working with mice which are genetically deaf, for example, and basically the brain can adapt only to your stimulation channel? Or yeah, how do you think about it, that at this time you have two competing inputs that need to be represented and processed?
Yeah, so for the experiments, there was only one input. I've made sure that there was no sound coming in, but
they hear.
But then
right?
they do hear throughout. So yes, it's a big question. Also, something that I want to look at is it deaf models of mice. Also, early onset deafness, so born deaf. What is the representation of sound in the auditory cortex then, and what happens with later life deafness? I don't know what will happen. It's something I'm really interested in finding out. One thing with mice or even humans born deaf is, yeah, this question of representation of sound within the auditory cortex. So one idea we have, and I'm testing right now, is the idea of using 2 implants. So a cochlear implant, so it goes through the auditory pathway, but also a cortical implant to help improve hearing restoration. Hopefully in a year or so I can give you a better answer.
Thank you.
Okay, please